Blamtasticful asks, what do you think this research means for phenomenal conservatism?
Not much directly. So phenomenal conservatism is this idea that suppose it seems to you that something is true, that provides some defeasible justification for believing it. So in other words, let's say you look outside, you see there's a tree. Seems like there's a tree outside. You could take that. So at that point, you're justified in thinking there's a tree outside unless someone can provide defeaters, or in other words, reasons to not think there's a tree outside. So roughly the idea is that we're justified in believing what seems to be the case up to and until someone provides reasons to override those beliefs or justification for those beliefs. On the surface, this looks like a perfectly sensible principle to adhere to. I don't know if my research bears on this question directly. One issue is that, if someone, so like Mike Humer is a big proponent of phenomenal conservatism. And Mike Humer might say something like this: seems to me like moral realism is true. If you want to say that I'm justified in believing moral realism is true unless you give me good arguments against moral realism. Now, let's just accept that that's the case for the sake of argument. Okay, well, it seems to me that moral realism is false. So I'm justified in thinking moral realism is false unless you provide reasons to think it's true. So like, first of all, anybody can we're all on a level playing field with what seems to be true to us, all else being held constant. Like, if it's just Humer and I in a single universe, he's in no better of a position than I am, all else being equal. So I'm justified in being an anti-realist. So, first, one of the issues with phenomenal conservatism is that it's very conservative. All it does is it basically says, I get to have my beliefs. It does not provide any public reason, all else being equal, for anybody else to care about. So like let's say I saw Bigfoot in the woods. I would have a reason to believe in Bigfoot. So I could say, look, it seems to me Bigfoot's real. But if you said, well, why do you think Bigfoot's real? I'm like, I saw Bigfoot in the woods. That's not publicly available to you. All you have is my report. It's just testimony. So I've got Humer's testimony. It seems like realism is true to him. He might be justified in being a realist. And the fact that he believes it and he's a smart guy is some evidence for me. Like, if someone that's really thought about this thinks it's true, sure, cool, I'll take that as some evidence. Not very decisive. For the same reason, if someone I really trust went in the woods and said they saw Bigfoot, I'd be like, okay, well, I'll update a little bit in favor of Bigfoot being real, but I have all these background reasons why I don't think Bigfoot is real. So that's kind of my reaction to that. But here's one of my concerns, and I this is not the point of phenomenal conservatism as a principle. But what I'm starting to see, because I'm starting to see phenomenal conservatism come up all across the internet, I'm surprised at how much uptake it's got. Here's what tends to happen. So here's a kind of dialogue that can happen with a realist and an anti-realist. So the realist will say, phenomenal conservatism, I have prima facie justification for believing realism because it's intuitive. It seems true to me. And so and they're like, unless you can present defeaters, you got any defeaters? And the anti-realist will go, evolutionary debunking arguments, whatever. They'll present defeaters. So, let's say that those defeaters are worth like 2 points. So like the phenomenal conservatism, their prima facie justification is 1 point in favor of realism. And the anti-realist presents 2 points of defeaters. What the realist can then do, and I'm not saying every realist does do this or that phenomenal conservatism entails this, but it kind of surreptitiously allows this to creep in the back door, is they could say, I know you present defeaters, but I'm very sorry, those defeaters aren't good enough. I don't think you quite understand just how intuitive realism seems. It's super intuitive. It's 3 points in favor of realism. So you better get better defeaters. So the anti-realist goes back to the drawing board. They come up with another defeater. Now it's 4 points in favor of anti-realism. Now the realist can go, I don't think you quite understand just how intuitive realism is. I super duper find it intuitive. It's 5 points in favor. So what this can allow for is perpetual goalpost shifting. The realist can always respond by saying the evidence, the defeaters that you presented aren't good enough. And so in practice, phenomenal conservatism isn't simply someone saying, I've got a point in favor of my view. Now, if there's points against it, whatever, we could weigh all the points for and against it. So there's arguments for realism, arguments against realism. What it could do is it could serve as like, whatever you do, whatever evidence you present, like in evidence, I'm just going to appeal to conservatism, like intuitions, to say it's n+1. And you'll actually get slogans, remarks, and comments from realists saying stuff like, any argument against realism is less plausible than realism. Now, if you actually treat that as like an operating principle, such that any argument someone says, you go, okay, that's fine, good evidence against realism, but less plausible than realism, you actually have an incorrigible position. But here's the tricky part. It's one thing to say realism is self-evident or I'm infallible and I cannot be mistaken about realism. Realists will not typically do this. They'll say, I'm a fallibilist, it's possible I'm wrong. I'm only saying, look, phenomenal conservatism, I'm not making a wild claim here. I'm just saying there's defeasible evidence, prima facie justification. It's very simple. It's just this little, it's 1 point. But then in practice, nothing can actually overturn their view, but they have the license to say, I'm a fallibilist, I could be wrong. You just have to present a good enough argument. But no argument will ever satisfy them. So I think, unfortunately, one of the unintended consequences of the pervasiveness of phenomenal conservatism is that people are starting to abuse and misuse it. It's being exploited to serve as a sort of epistemic trump card.
Defeater to defeat all defeaters in the whole.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
And a friend of mine pointed out, he's like, it kind of reminds me of those discussions you have when you're young. I don't know if other people had these. I definitely had these, so I immediately knew what he was talking about. Where someone's like, if you don't give me my half of the cookie, I'm gonna smash you with a hammer. And like, oh yeah, well I'll wear armor, and then you can't. I go, oh yeah, well then I'll get a bulldozer. Oh yeah, well then I'll build a castle. And like, well I'll get a spaceship with lasers. Oh yeah, well I'll get a force field. And then kids will do the moves, or it's like, I'll blast you with my force field. Oh, I'll block. So it's this kind of dialogue where the person always tries to one up the other person. And so a person that can do this can always just say, my intuition is stronger than whatever your evidence is. And what that works like is, and the problem is, instead of just saying, look, I have a prior of 1, or I assign 100% probability to realism being true, haha, I win, is you're saying it's not 1, but it's like arbitrarily just enough higher than whatever you present that I always win anyway. So it's sort of what it's resulting in, and what I end up calling it, I got to write a paper on this or something, is I call it phenomenal dogmatism. It ends up being a sort of sneaky way of a person rationalizing their incorrigibility, and then anointing it with this sort of pseudo defeasibility. It's not really.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, it's like it's a sort of move that can be made in order to win the disagreement, because within the context of the disagreement, it's generally accepted that if you can provide like additional reasons that bear on the claim that's disputed, well then you're justifying it by giving those reasons. And then phenomenal conservatism, I think this is what you're saying, seems to function as this thing that can be talked about as conferring justification, but there's actually no additional kind of like standards that are required other than that you believe the disputed claim. And so it's just being used in that way. It's like, yeah, well, I've got more to say about that. Like,
right. And a friend of mine pointed this out as well. I've been discussing this privately quite a bit. Is they said, it's hard to pin down what exactly, there's something wrong with this phenomenal conservatism move. There's something, imagine a person going into a discourse and saying, all the work to show that I'm wrong is on you because it super duper seems to me like something is the case. There's something sort of, I think, dialectically unvirtuous about that. To just make it the case that everyone else has the work of showing you're not correct. Why? It seems weird. It seems weird to just go around going, I could think whatever I want unless you could show I'm wrong. Sure, you can, but like, you can do that, fine. But that's setting the bar for justification so low that it's not interesting. But because again, how is, someone can make this move for pretty much anything. Seems to me like God exists. So you want to argue God doesn't exist? Present defeaters. Otherwise, I'm justified in believing God exists. But you could get real silly with it. You could just say, I think 4 is a prime number, unless you could present defeaters. And then if someone, because someone could go, well, I could divide 4 by 2 and 4 and 1, so it's not a prime number. To go, I know it looks like that, but it's super duper mega ultra to the max. Seems to me like 4 is a prime number anyway. So, you're not overriding the defeasible intuition that I have. Let's call it an epistemic blank check. That's right. So phenomenal conservatism shouldn't be an epistemic blank check, and I don't think Hume or anyone else intended it to be. But that's how people are using it in practice. And I hope Hume and others can agree with me that that's not an appropriate extension of the way that it should be used.
Yeah, it's not
an entailment of it. So it's being sort of distorted and warped in practice.